Hey guys, TubaSteve here for deucescrack.com. In case that isn't apparent by my incredibly off-center logo here on the screen. I am going to be bringing you episode 7 today of Road to Robusto No Limit Edition. Today I'm going to be doing a 2-table video at 50 NL where I will be actually reviewing my play. So the reason there's no tables up here yet is because I won't be loading any. I'll be loading up a video. But beforehand, I'm actually going to discuss something about poker learning with you guys that I think is pretty important. I really want to make sure that you guys are sort of aware of why I'm able to get away with playing as loose as I do in these games, and how you can start, opening up your game to sort of start moving away from the quote-unquote tagfish mentality. And I don't say that to offend anyone. But that's what it's kind of called, where you just play your hand straight up, and you often end up becoming a marginal winner or a loser in the games because of this, because you're so exploitable. But I really want to make sure that people are applying the stuff that they learn here correctly, and making sure that you're applying theory when you're playing and thinking about your overall strategy. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the stages of learning, and this is actually something I discussed in a thread that I started a little while ago, a few days ago probably. Well, I mean, who knows when y'all are watching this video, but I started a thread on this, and what it's called is the 4 stages of competence. And so I want to talk about how you have to be aware of what level of competence you have as far as poker goes, and in terms of, where you need to move to improve your game next. And so everybody should sort of try to become more aware of not just, their generally where they fall in terms of the 4 types of competence, but also, realize that different parts of your game are going to be in different stages of this. So, that'll be more apparent when I explain. So unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint set up for this, just because I didn't really know how to figure out how to get it onto the small screen without doing a lot of finagling. But I just want to show you guys real quick a little list here of the 4 stages, and you can look this up online on Wikipedia or something like that for more information. But the first stage that most people are going to start out in when they play poker, or maybe even everyone, is going to be unconscious incompetence. So what that means is you don't actually know what sort of mistakes you're making, and you might not even realize that you're making a mistake. Here I can probably say question mark, right? Because it's not even that you're making mistakes, that you don't know that you're making mistakes. So the next step is sort of where I think most of you guys are probably going to be at, which is conscious incompetence. You realize, and before I get into that, really, if you don't realize that you are at this stage yet, be aware that, no offense, but if you're watching this video, you probably have a lot of conscious incompetence in your game, right? Or else you wouldn't need to watch videos to beat lower stakes. And I don't say that to be a slam on anyone. It's the same exact thing I would tell any of my students. It's really important to be self-aware, and really important not to think you're a better player than you are, or something like that, because that's only going to lead to disaster, right? You try to move up a limit because you think you're awesome, and you get crushed, and then you blame it all on variance, and it just ends up, it can end up setting off this sort of tilt cycle that we really, really, really want to avoid. And of course, for more information on that, you can check out Eightfold Path to Poker Enlightenment by Tommy Angelo. The Eightfold Path, excuse me. Can't talk today. So anyhow, back to conscious incompetence. Again, I think this is probably where most of you guys are. And so the idea here is that we're finally starting to learn that we're making mistakes, and now we can learn to stop making them. And the biggest thing that any of us really are trying to teach our students before we move on to more advanced concepts is going to be how to stop making mistakes that are sort of just huge, fundamental errors based on theory. So, there will be a hand at the beginning where, I have ace-queen, and I think that, I'm going to point out a common mistake that I think people are making, that is just really, really a large fundamental mistake. And a lot of you might not be making it at this point, but I see it in the forums all the time. I'm actually making a little note so I don't forget to relate this. Anyhow, so once you learn how to stop making mistakes of your own, that's when we sort of start just being able to beat fish for the most part, and stuff like that, just because they're playing so badly that we don't really have to pay too much attention to exploitation in order to make money off of them. But, once you reach a certain point, you're not going to be able to make money just by, playing a sort of really tight beginner strategy. So from the ground up series that I did with Nowhere Man is sort of the whole idea behind that is to not only teach you guys to stop making big mistakes, but to get you to realize that you're making them in the first place, which is why the strategy we lay out there is relatively basic, and there's no there's no room for like light 3-betting or anything like that, and even our ranges for stealing are relatively tight. So moving along from conscious incompetence is going to be the next stage, conscious competence, where you no longer are making these huge mistakes, but you're sort of aware that you sort of have the potential to make the mistake at any time, So the idea there is that you know what to do, you just have to think about it a little bit before you come up with the right answer. And so I think, again, there's going to be a lot of you guys that are sort of in this situation where you've watched plenty of videos, you're a winner at, say, up to 25 NL, but then when it comes to 50 NL, you just aren't really making much headway. There's less fish, the regs are a little bit better, and so on. And so what we need to start working on then is learning how to exploit others. And so, most of the videos on Deuces Cracked, I would say, especially at the small to mid-stakes level, and really more so at mid-stakes, is going to be sort of about learning how to exploit others, because you have to sort of reach a certain level of ability before you can make it to those limits anyhow, and it just sort of, in my opinion, happens to fall around mid-stakes where stuff like learning to exploit others really, really becomes important over things like game selection and stuff like that, which I would say is more important at micros. And it's granted, it's when I say it's more important, I mean relatively more important. So game selection is probably more important absolutely than it is, or excuse me, at like 2-4 than it is at 50-cent dollar or 25.50. But that said, if you don't game select at 25.50, you're much more likely to end up in a good game, so it doesn't actually hurt you that much. Anyway, like I was about to say, most of the videos we have are probably something along the lines of conscious competence, learning how to exploit others, realizing that we can pay attention to our opponents, their tendencies and their stats, and if they're 3-betting too much, we can 4-bet them, right? If they're folding their big blind too much, we can steal any 2 cards from the small blind, stuff like that. Now, moving on from that is sort of what the best players at all of their stakes tend to do, and especially as you move up. Granted, the best players at 25 NL might still not really need to do this, but if you're playing nosebleeds or high stakes of any kind or anything, you really need to move on from not just fixing your own mistakes and then exploiting other people's mistakes, but we need to move to the next stage, which is learning to get other people to exploit themselves. And I have that up here with unconscious competence, which, it doesn't really strictly fit because, granted, like I said, all of these different parts of your game are going to fall under one of these categories at some point, and you're constantly going to be moving back and forth between 2, 3, and 4, and, well, really even 1, 2, 3, and 4, because clearly, if we all knew every single mistake we were making, we would be able to fix them all given enough time. And that's simply not the case. It's impossible to know, what all of our mistakes are unless we can get some guy that has no limit hold'em solved to watch us play for hours and hours and hours and hours, right? So anyway, it doesn't quite match up fully with unconscious competence, but if you don't sort of have the unconscious competence necessary to exploit others without really thinking about it. And again, I didn't define it, I guess, but unconscious competence being the ability to make all the correct moves without actually thinking about it. So I think I mentioned this before. I feel like when I play low stakes, micro stakes, I don't have to really think too much about what I'm doing. Things like table dynamics, for example. I pay attention to the table dynamics without consciously looking and beforehand and saying, okay, gotta look at table dynamics. Now, granted, also sometimes I forget, but usually that's when I'm like making videos or not playing my A game. But anyway, that's a form of unconscious competence where I am always looking at table dynamics. But if I'm looking through a student, video or a database or any kind of coaching like that, I guess, I'll often look down and see that they know they should be table selecting, and I'll point out, hey man, this table's not looking so hot, you should have left this, and they'll they'll say, "Oh man, you're totally right," because they know that that's what they're supposed to be doing, and they are trying, but they're not quite to the level where it's second nature, right? And so that's sort of what unconscious competence is about, is everything becoming second nature. And the reason that I have that next to learn to get others to exploit themselves up here is because you have to have a really, really good understanding of poker theory, and you have to understand how your total game strategy affects the way people play against you in every situation, right? So there was a hand in the last video, I believe, where I raised with Jack 6 offsuit in the small blind. And it's funny, if you guys are following Deuces Cracked University, Tecmo Bowl, or I'm sorry, I totally can't talk today. Tecmo Super Bowl did he's doing the Deuces Cracked University, he's running that, where he's doing little mini quizzes for these videos. Hopefully there's some good stuff out of this one. But anyway, I actually made a comment to him because he put that Jack 6 steel hand in the quiz, and not to call him out or anything, because I definitely don't really care too much one way or the other, and I don't mind, but I think it actually kind of, as far as a teaching tool goes, it wasn't ideal because the question was worded such that it didn't really emphasize why we were raising the Jack 6 and how it affected our overall strategy. It just said, like, if you have Jack 6 and this happens, what should you do, right? And so you have to realize that the reason I can raise a hand like Jack 6 there is because, it's not because I expect it to be plus EV in a vacuum necessarily, although I think in that exact example maybe I did, but just in general, we have to realize that it's okay to play some hands that are not very profitable because it's going to make the other ones more profitable. And so this is just the very basis of image. If you play looser, people will play looser against you. In microstakes, they'll play looser, and they'll tend to make bigger call downs on late streets. In 2-4 games or something, they'll tend to play looser and also more aggressively, right? So we have to really be aware of how our image is affecting these sort of reactions from our opponents, and realize that if we can get others to exploit themselves, we can make a ton more money. So basically, if we want to think about this still in terms of mistakes, conscious incompetence in terms of sort of general thought again, is when we learn to stop making our own mistakes. Conscious competence is when we're good enough that we realize most of our own mistakes and start trying to figure out the mistakes that our opponents are making because we're more aware. And then unconscious competence comes from the fact that we realize we can get people to play badly against us, and we can get them to actually make more mistakes based on the way we're playing. And a lot of that has to do with trading those mistakes with them. So again, making a small minus EV play is fine if you think it'll build some image for you and it'll cause your opponent to make a huge mistake later on. So again, I feel like I got a little redundant there, but if any of that's not clear, please let me know in the forum, and I'll try to clarify myself. And again, I realize that these don't directly match up before the NIT police come after me, but I think it's useful still as a way to think about your game. So anyway, what we realize is that the best players in any stakes are all playing pretty much optimally in terms of sort of game theory considerations, at least compared to lower stakes. If you ask Krantz if everybody's playing game theoretically optimally at 25-50, he'd probably say, "What hell no," but compared to us, right? So yeah, what we have to realize also is that when you're watching these videos, it's not enough to just sort of copy what I'm doing, as I sort of mentioned earlier, but you have to really understand why I'm doing what I'm doing and realize how it affects my overall total game plan. In order to do that, you have to instead of copying one play off of me, you would really probably have to just copy my whole game plan. And if you're going to do that, you might as well learn how I think instead of just learning what I do, because that'll generalize it to a lot of other situations. And again, you'd have to sort of watch me play for hours and hours and hours, right? So again, just making sure, as far as when you're watching these videos goes, you're correctly applying the theory and realizing that I'm playing so loose and stuff because I'm aware of the adjustments that my opponents are making, and I'm also aware of the correct adjustments to make in response to that. And really that again comes down to unconscious competence of so many different factors, So you'll get there eventually. It just takes a lot of practice, and you gotta, try to be really self-aware and always be asking other people for advice, because it's easy to get really like locked into, a bad rut when you don't even realize what you're doing wrong. And so the only way to get out of it is to talk to other people that have been there. Um, yeah, I think that's about it for that. So let me make sure I didn't want to say anything else on the subject, and I don't believe I do. Oh yeah, one more thing. So I want to talk about ways you could make, start sort of learning to make adjustments, straying from ABC poker. Really the thing to do is just sort of implement some things really, really slowly and do it, on the margin. So on the margin meaning add just like one more thing at a time, one more thing, and see what happens. So start out by, let's take 3-betting as an example. Most people, say playing like 10NL, 25NL and stuff that I see in the forums seem to play a game where they're really only 3-betting like tens plus and ace king, maybe jack, maybe even just jacks plus depending on how tight they are. In maybe 100% or 90% of the time they're 3-betting with that range, and then very, very rarely, they'll 3-bet a hand like ace queen or something like that. So, you might think, well, how can I fix this? You definitely want to make sure you're doing it gradually so that you can learn how it affects the overall dynamic of your play. So instead of starting out, if you the worst thing that you could do probably is to start, as a 15-12, watch this series, and then try to play 24-20. That's probably about the worst thing that you could do. Start out by trying to play like 18-15, right? As far as 3-betting goes, back to that, we can start out by adding a few hands at a time to our 3-bet range and see how it affects people. See how it affects, what action you get. People that tend to play really, really nitty will often never get action, right? And so if you start 3-betting a few more hands, just a few more, you might start noticing that everybody opens up against you, and you might not have to make dramatic changes to your game in order to become more profitable, right? So, if you want to start 3-betting light, start out by 3-betting ace queen more often in a late position situation. Butt off versus butt off. God, I really cannot talk today. I apologize, folks. But cutoff versus button, for example. Start 3-betting ace queen there if you use the flat with it. Start, from there, then you can start 3-betting, occasionally with ace jack on the button, and only do it from the button for starters or something. I mean, really, like that's an over exaggeration, but it's better to to do too little than not enough. And so I realize that kind of goes against what I said about copying my play. Because I said if you're going to copy my specific play, you should do it all and not just one thing at a time. But again, that's not really what I'm saying either. Something like 3-betting ace queen or 3-betting, a better example would be something like king queen. How many of you guys 3-bet king queen regularly? Probably not too many. I could be mistaken, but just a few little things like that on the margin, So really, I guess it still holds, because if you just start opening Jack 6 offsuit, that's not really adding hands on the margin. That's adding, I mean, it is, but it's the wrong kind of hand. So we also want to add hands that are, that's probably obvious, but you want to make sure you're not just opening randomly with like Jack 6 offsuit, and that's the only hand you're randomly opening with. You might as well do it with a good hand too. It probably doesn't need to be said, so you guys can make fun of me or something for that stupid comment. Okay, so I think that's just about going to do it for this discussion. And so, ironically enough, the video that I recorded for you guys, I ended up playing fairly tight in, and I thought that was kind of interesting, just because one of the things that I mentioned earlier in the series as well is that I tend to think people force action too much rather than attacking the situation. And so here it just so happened that I didn't get on as good of tables, so there weren't as many fish to isolate. I was a little card dead too, comparatively, not a huge deal. I still managed to play like 21-18 or something like that, but still I was a little bit more card dead. The table dynamics weren't quite as good. I had some short stacks to contend with, and I thought about switching out tables, but I thought that it would actually be more educational to sort of see me play a more normal style, and you can kind of think about why that is happening, and maybe try to look for spots where you've seen me raise certain hands in certain positions in other videos, but against different players, and try to see if you can understand why I'm playing differently. So take that as an exercise upon yourselves. Alrighty, so with that out of the way, we'll move right on to the video. So here's sort of that the first hand that I was mentioning earlier about the ace queen. This is a spot where a lot of you guys are probably going to be sitting there scratching your head like, really? People have a problem with this? But I mean, at least I kind of did at first. And again, I only say that to illustrate how not close it is, not to poke fun at anyone. But you know, this is a spot where if we're not 3-betting here, we're just massively, massively undervaluing a hand like ace queen suited. And so what I've got here, in fact, let's roll it. What I've got here is a poker stove showing, you know, sort of a calculation that I think should allay some people's worries. I often find that people, when they have ace queen type hand, are so or even ace jack or whatever, they're so preoccupied with the fact that they think their opponent is only going to call them with a really tight range, and that it's mostly going to be better hands. So I've actually taken poker stove here, and I put in a pretty tight range of hands for somebody to continue facing a 3-bet. And so far what we have here, you know, tens, ace jack suited or better, king queen suited, ace queen offsuit or better, of course, and king queen. And so this is assuming that they this is sort of just their continuing range. We're not sure if they're going to call with it, and we're not sure if they're going to 4-bet with it, but it doesn't really matter. The fact is, against a range of hands that your opponent continues with, you're a pretty big favorite. Now, let's take out, you know, those big hands here so we can see more, you know, what our equity is inclined to be, you know, against a more reasonable calling range, assuming that most people at micros are 4-betting with ace king and, or excuse me, with aces and kings. And we'll leave what we're going to do is we're going to leave ace king suited in there for now. If we put ace king and ace king suited in there, it's going to make our equity a lot better than if we just put ace king suited, because there's 4 combinations of ace king suited and 12 of offsuit. So, you know, once we run the numbers, you can see that we're a 55% favorite against this calling range. And so what you have to also realize about 3-bet pots is that when you're, you know, even against like a worst case scenario range, you've got like 46% equity in a spot like this. Again, that's against like just the range that he continues with, not saying like that this number really translates directly into anything, but just that when in general your equity is this good against the range of hands he's willing to continue with, if you have any fold equity whatsoever pre-flop or post-flop, it's going to be very profitable to 3-bet. So, you know, even if his, I mean, and besides that, if his range is even tighter than this, you make a bunch of money off him folding. And I think out of position, you know, people tend to underestimate how much of the EV of the 3-bet comes from the fold equity and not just from, you know, when you get called and stuff like that. So what we have to consider is that, you know, even with 46% equity here, if we knew for some reason that he would call with all these hands and only this range of hands, I would definitely still 3-bet because I'm going to have the initiative, and so it doesn't matter what my equity is pre-even. It matters, you know, how much money am I going to make in the hand through that, you know, realizing this equity and getting him to fold. And so, you know, on most flops, you know, we have a ton of fold equity against at least part of his range. You have to consider, like, on a king high flop, even on a, you know, an ace king or a queen high flop, we have a bunch of fold equity, at least against some people, you know, against his mid pairs and lower pairs and stuff like that. And, you know, of course, on an ace high board, he has to fold king queen and whatnot. So this isn't an argument really for us having ace queen. It's more an argument for just how we can own him post flop, no matter what our cards are. You know, so with medium pairs, there's still at least some combos that he has to fold. And since we do have ace queen, you know, we're going to have the best hand in a lot of those spots anyway. And we don't really have to worry about getting sucked out on by his range, you know, just in case. That comment was probably unnecessary. But anyway, and you know, against the other hands, of course, ace jack, king queen, ace queen, and king queen, you know, we're not going to ever make a lot of money off them when we make a hand. And of course, against ace king, we're going to lose a bunch of money when we both hit an ace, of course. But still, you know, all the other times that you both miss, the other, what, like 80-some% of the time that you both miss the flop, or I guess it's not quite that much, but when you both have an ace, it's probably like 75% or 70-ish in that region for him to hit the flop at all. My point being, that you're only going to both flop an ace like 12% of the time. The other 82% of the time, you either bet he calls and you give up, or you bet and win, or you bet and he calls and you have the best hand. If a queen flops, So there's really not a bad situation you can end up in here if he's going to flat call with a lot of these big unpaired hands, because you're going to be able to c-bet low flops and he's going to have to fold. And we got to realize also that if we thought his range was something like this, we would probably want to c-bet just about any flop, because tens, jacks, queens, kings, and aces would be let's see, 6 times 5 is 30 combos of hands. And there's 36 combos just of ace, king, ace, queen, and king, queen. And then once you add in the other 4 suited hands we have here, that's 16 more combinations. So a 55-ish% c-bet should be profitable on any board, really, if we knew that this was his exact range. Now, granted, we don't, and against most people, their ranges are skewed a lot more towards hands that do hit on like low flops and stuff. And we should keep that in mind, but this is sort of just like a theoretical debate, I guess. So anyway, basically, the point being, even if you think he calls with some better hands sometimes, you're going to make money off those hands because of your fold equity, assuming that he's not adjusting by bluffing, right? And so that's kind of what that hinges upon, is that your opponent's never bluffing, and that your opponent also doesn't have very many hands that have draws. So against guys that are playing 10-9, 10-8, 9-8, all these suited connector type stuff, clearly we're going to have much worse fold equity if a lot of stuff like that is in their range on like low boards, for example. So, and also again, if people are floating with the big cards, then also our assumption doesn't hold about betting any flop, but it is worth looking at, based on the combos. All right. Anyway, I got a little bit sidetracked there, but definitely a spot where we want to be 3-betting. So with pocket kings, we have a pretty standard spot where we raise under the gun, and this shorty, checks it to us. Our play here is going to be to bet, of course. Now the bet size is interesting, I think. Really here, let's see, so I elected to bet 250, yeah. And given that he's got 840 left in the stack, we could probably play it either one of 2 ways on this board. I think, one of them is superior, but our plan here could probably be to like bet real small and get value on 3 streets, which I would do against some guys, and I would do that if he had more chips in his stack, but you can't see it now. There, okay, so he had 840 left and the pot was 360, so if we bet 250 and he calls, there's going to be about 8 in there, and he's going to have about 5 or 7 or something like that anyway, so he's going to have really good odds on both of the 2 streets there. So that's sort of what you want to think about in these situations against shorties, is making sure that you can pick bet sizes that don't give your opponent really, really good odds, but also that give him good enough odds to want to call you down light. And against these guys, half-ish to anywhere from like 40 to 60% pop bets on the flop, depending on how wet or dry the board is, probably would work. And so on a drier board, this board is not incredibly dry, although it's not incredibly wet either. But Jack 8-5, there are a lot of straight draws out there, and stuff like that, right? But the thing is, if we bet smaller and he calls with a straight draw, he's really not getting the correct odds, unless he had a hand like 10-9 or 6-7, in which case it doesn't really matter how much we bet. That's kind of assuming he has a slightly deeper stack, because here if we bet like pot and he has 10-9, he should fold, but that's not my point overall. Okay, so that's pretty minor. The next hand that we have over here on the left would be ace-7 suited, and so this is a spot where we could also go one of 2 ways. We could either 3-bet this hand, or we could just call. Now, I have some hands on this guy, Tyndall Tangel, but I don't think that, none of them are recent, and I don't have any notes on him, so I'm not real sure about what he's doing. Furthermore, this Mephistophel guy is pretty new at the table, so, I could squeeze here, but I just don't know how often they're folding, and I know that calling is going to be profitable. So I elected to go and take the conservative route. I actually think that, you know, it's really just purely a table dynamics issue here. You know, it's so dependent on the other players, but for the most part, it's going to be more profitable to call here, I think, on the button and see a flop. Some situations in which I wouldn't would be if I had loose squeezers in the blinds. Um, then I would probably be more inclined to 3-bet it myself or just fold if I didn't think that the squeeze would be profitable on my own end. And that's just because, you know, if you're going to call here with a squeezer in the blinds, when he sees 3 guys lined up to go, he is going to be, you know, right behind him with that squeeze. So this is you know, it's something that's not really going to be too much of a factor till you guys move up for the most part, but it's definitely a consideration. As far as reasons to call, it's kind of interesting. Any of my students that take the group coaching that are watching this, we actually cover almost the exact same situation in the lesson. But you know, reasons to call would be implied odds, pretty much, and especially multi-way action. And so if they're, you know, the players in the blinds are bad, or one of the openers or the caller or both obviously are bad, then, you know, I'm definitely more inclined to call. And that's heads up too, you know, because this is a hand that plays pretty well even in a heads up pot, especially well, not just especially, but mainly when you have position. So, you know, there's pros and cons to each, but here I think that calling is better. I gotta stop making that little noise when I stutter. Sorry about that, guys. And so when I call here in a multi-way pot, I mean, my plan is pretty much to just chase draws. If I flop an ace, I'm going to be really careful. It's a situation where, like, if I get 4-way action and then the Tyndall Tango guys bets the flop, in a 50 NL game, you almost... it's kind of a tough thing to do, but you really almost might as well fold, right? Because who at 50 NL, especially when you're playing with a bunch of bad opponents, you know, what reg is going to c-bet an ace-high flop into 3 other people without an ace? You know, it's very, very unlikely. You know, at 2-4, there's a little bit more of that because of balance. People are more aware, so people know that in a, you know, a 3 or 4-way pot, you gotta you can't just bet the nuts, or, you know, it's really, really super easy to play against you. But, you know, here, and even at 2-4, I don't think it's... I don't even play 2-4, I should clarify. I'm just kind of trying to give you guys a contrast. I've seen Manchild play a ton of it, but anyway, the ideas hold true for sure. Okay, so let's keep going here. You know, this board I'm not really too happy with, obviously. So, oh, but what I was saying, you know, is the ace high board at a micro stakes game. I think when he bets, he almost always just has an ace, and therefore, you know, unless your plan is to call and try to bluff him off the ace later, then I think you should probably fold. Because you certainly don't have implied odds to hit a 3-outer against ace-king when you flop, you know, an ace, you know, multi-way. Okay, so for this video I'm going to try to jump around so that there's not much, you know, dead space. So I've skipped ahead to the next hand, which is only, you know, a few seconds later really, but here we have ace-9 on table 2. Now, again, I want to make sure you guys are aware that since this one guy is sitting out, well, I mean, technically he's about to sit down, but still, since he's not at the table, we are actually 5-handed here, and so therefore we are actually in the cutoff. And so a hand like ace-9 offsuit, I personally think should be a pretty standard cutoff raise. Again, that comes down to knowing why you're raising it, knowing what boards are good for it, and stuff like that. But if you're not already opening it, you know, this is the type of hand that you can start opening stuff like this a little bit more in the cutoff. You know, ace-8, ace-7 type hands in the cutoff are okay. Suited aces are amazing from the cutoff and the button. I personally open any suited ace from the cutoff end or the button. You guys, again, can work that into your game gradually and see how it goes. But anyway, I just want to make sure that you guys are paying attention to all the dynamics here. And so we have a guy on the button who is kind of aggro so far, but he has not 3-bet me or anything. You can see I've been at this table for a little while. I was just playing around on here before I started recording, just for a few minutes while I was getting organized. But he hasn't 3-bet me personally, so I don't really have any reason to believe he's going to be trying to attack this. And if I see that he is, then I might have to tighten up from the cutoff. But that said, I think Ace 9 is still a strong enough hand to raise. And if we look at the other two players, as I mentioned, a short stack here, we should actually be more inclined to play a hand like this because they'll go broke with worse. And then this nit, we can raise. It doesn't really matter what our cards are because of our skill advantage against him and the fact that he's folding so much, and we can exploit that. So there's an example of the learning to find opponent mistakes. Is when you see this nitty guy, is this nitty? You should steal a lot. And then to extend that example a little bit more, if he decided to, if he was folding a lot, you could probably just keep raising, and eventually you would raise so much that maybe he would adjust. And so once he does adjust, you sort of switch back. And so that's sort of how you would create a mistake in that situation. It's just by pounding on him so much that he eventually gets sick of it. And when he gets sick of it, he might either, and of course, full into a squeeze here. When he gets sick of it, he might do a couple things. He might start calling and then folding the flop because he's so, aggravated by your steals. He might call and start check raising the flop, right? He might call, well, I guess those are the two main options. But he might 3-bet pre-flop more. He might fold pre-flop more because he doesn't want to have to play out of position against you. Say if his calling hasn't been working for him hasn't been working out for him, or something like that. So when it comes to this third sort of level of mistakes, where the first one being stop making them, the second one being find other people's, and the third being create them with other people. You can kind of see that in order to do, number 3 effectively, we have to be very, very aware of our image and our opponent's image. And, it's impossible to do that until you're pretty familiar with standard lines and the way people are playing in, lots and lots of different situations as a default, because you have to know their default play in order to know their adjustment, right? So it just requires really, really good hand reading and a great feel for how different guys play different hands as a default, Which, again, sorry for being a little redundant, but I just want to make sure that the point is clear. So here with King 9, I considered 3-betting, but I decided against it just because the guy had been relatively loose so far. Not a ton of history on him, but I wasn't quite ready to go too crazy against him yet. But I think it would have been an okay spot. I can't really. I don't have a great argument for why I didn't do it myself personally. So perhaps I should have. Again, it's a type of spot where, like, 3-betting this is not something I necessarily expect to be hugely plus EV or even plus EV at all. Necessarily, it could be slightly negative EV. But the sooner I try, the sooner I find out, and it also creates image. So again, these slight minus EV things, as long as we're aware of what we're doing, are not really a problem because they can actually make us more money in the long run. And I really, really want to emphasize that this is not TubaSteve saying go make a bunch of stupid plays. I'm saying it's okay to make thin plays. Thin plays are ones that are very, very close, not ones that are very, very bad, right? So just try to keep that stuff in mind, and you should be all right. So this was an interesting spot with the ace-5. I was a little bit torn. I think that, the range of hands that these guys are limping in with is very, very wide. I just wasn't certain if I could play ace-5 profitably in a multi-way pot if they both called. So what I actually think I should have done here, as opposed to raising, which is what I did, is limp. because I think that given that I'm on the button, I'm much better than them, and I don't think I'm going to be exploited unless it's by Perk76, who I would assume, even though he's pretty aggro, probably still plays fairly tight from the blinds, just because most people don't raise enough hands from the blinds. So, with those, those assumptions that I'm making, I think that limping here would definitely be more profitable than folding, and I'm sort of unsure about isolating versus two shorties, although I'm tempted to think that with a hand like Ace-5 that fares kind of poorly multi-way, and also doesn't flop particularly great, I think it's probably not a great idea. But, heads up versus a full stack, I'm isolating it all day long. And even in this spot versus two full stacks, I'm isolating it all day long. But I was just really, really too worried that I was going to get two callers. And so you can kind of think of this as sort of like a full ring type of situation that you might encounter when you go play live, is that you're often going to have these guys that are limping and limping and limping, but they never fold to a raise, and if you try to isolate with like, 7-9 suited, you just end up getting like 5 callers in some pot where you have like a 1.5 PSB left on the flop, even though you've only put in 10 pre, right? Or something, you end up with some stupid spots like that, and so we can take a page from the live poker book and try to limp some of these hands against guys that are really passive in spots where we don't think that we're going to get exploited. And I mentioned that in another video before, but it's worth talking about again. Alright, so when we do, once we do raise and we get called, given that this guy now has, 3 times the pot himself, I think we pretty much have to stack off against him, since we're assuming that he's a bad short stack player, right? So, let me see, how much did I actually bet? I like betting relatively large on a flop like this, even against this, player, so that we can shove the turn for a decent sized bet. I believe that I actually bet 450, which is 3/4 pot. Which isn't huge. Let's see in a second. Wait for it. Yeah, see, I wanted to bet 350, then I decided against it. I don't know if you caught that or not, but okay, so I bet 4. So I bet 2/3. Given that the guy, so let's see. Okay, yeah, so given that he had 1750, there was about 10 in that pot already. Oh no, excuse me, 6 in that pot already. If he called, there would be 10 more in the pot, so there would have been 16 in the middle if he'd called, and he would have had 1350 behind. So, we can easily shove the turn. So the 4 bet is fine there. And I should clarify when I say this, I do expect to get called by better aces sometimes, but I also expect to get called by King X draws and 7X sometimes. You would be surprised. Probably what some of these guys will show up with. The shorties, I mean. Alright, so once we raise with King 10 and we flop a pair against the shorties, I was pretty happy with my hand here on the flop. Top pair good kicker on a board where they can continue with quite a large range, each of them, of, worse kings, Jack X, 2 hearts, any kind of straight cards, Queen 10, Ace Queen, if they, I wouldn't be too surprised if these were the type of guys that would flat Ace Queen. All that stuff. 10-9 even, just the bottom gut shot is going to continue here a lot of the time from bad players. So, there's just a ton of value in a bet here. However, you'll see in a second, the turn card is not quite so favorable for me. Okay, so alright, sorry if there was a hitch there, but I wanted to do some PokerStove real quick before I got in here. Just because I think it's really, useful for analysis. So if we look here, I've given these two guys pretty, and again, I'm just trying to illustrate the equity here. I'm not trying to really teach you guys that why we should check fold on the 9 necessarily, just because I think it's probably kind of obvious. But it's always good to double check and prove this stuff with a bit of math analysis, or it's not really math, I guess, but a bit of analysis. So we see here that I gave these guys 2 relatively loose ranges I'm not going to click on the range right now. I will load it up in a second so you can see it, but sometimes Stove loses it, and I don't want that. I don't have to put it back in. So I'll look at it again in a second. They're almost the same, just because I'm not going to make different assumptions about these two players because I have literally the exact same information, except the other guys played a couple of hands. But as far as I'm concerned, they're both loose, passive, bad short stacks, and they're going to play real similarly. So you can basically see here that we are not doing super great against two players, but this is assuming that they both call. We have to realize that we're also going to fold out a lot of hands that have equity, and so we in a three-way pot, if we knew both players were calling, we would need 33% equity to break even, and here we have 38%. So you can see, if both people are calling, you're doing fine, and clearly, if one of them is folding, your equity should go up, a fair amount. And we'll actually look at that in a second. But before I do that, again, because I don't want to lose any of my ranges here, I am going to illustrate how our equity changes on the turn. And so if we put on the old 9 of hearts here, and see, because again, this is the flop calling range we give our opponents, including lots of kings, lots of jacks, lots of straight draws, and I didn't even really include that many draws because it doesn't matter. This is sort of a worst case. There's only really only a handful of flush draws in this range. Most of what gives us this equity is going to be made hands. So if you click evaluate here on the 9 of hearts, you'll see that again, this is not a rigorous analysis, but you can see how much our equity drops. It's pretty considerable. And so again, for the sake of learning how this shit really works at its lowest level, and working on our overall strategy a bit by understanding ranges, we'll just delete all this stuff for this guy. And by the way, it came out to see what it did. It just did some weirdness, which is why I didn't want to risk it. But excuse me, one sec. Sorry. We can see here that if we evaluate again, of course we're like a huge favorite on the flop. Now the more interesting decision that we have to make is, well, how does our equity change on the turn against one person? Whoops. So we just add the 9 of hearts again, and you can actually see that your equity does not go down that much. So a lot of people would just check fold if they got called in one spot here, rather than check calling once and sort of seeing what happened on the later street. So that appears to be a mistake, given the chance that you may hit some sort of weird backdoor hand like a queen or a 10 or a heart or something like that. That may give you the best hand if you were losing before. So as long as your plan is probably to just like call one bet and then give it up on the river if they bet again. Oh, well, actually, now that I look at it, that's irrelevant because we are dealing with short stacks. Forgive me, that's irrelevant because we're dealing with short stacks, and so you can see here that we should actually, probably be willing to get it in. And in fact, even though we don't have the most equity, I would go ahead and shove here because I think that you're going to have some fold equity, right? And so your equity when called is still going to be below 50%, but since you have fold equity, it's going to be profitable. And if you check, he then has the option to decide when money goes in. So he might even only bet if he has a good hand, and he might check back all the other stuff. So even though shoving appears to be minus EV, given the fact that we have some fold equity, and if we check and he shoves, we have to call, because we're not really sure of his range, I think that shoving ourselves is probably better. And again, this range does not have very many draws, so I should clarify that since it doesn't have very many draws, we might even when we add more, we might see that it's a fold, a check fold. So let's actually do that real quick. Because this guy should have like a ton of them. Oh, ace 5 is not really relevant, I guess. I think the conclusion that I'm going to end with is that we should probably just check, call, shove because of our equity. And you can see here, I'm going through all this stuff, and I'm sort of surprising myself a little bit, and that's what you have to do. Just because, I'm realizing that there are little factors that I'm not taking into consideration even, such as the fact that I discounted draws. So we add a few more, you can see that we lose a bit more equity. So I think basically, you know, especially given the fact that we're going to have outs against some of, a few of his draws, if we start adding a bunch more, we should still have plenty of equity to check call, because if we check any bets, either of them bets here, at most we need 33% equity to continue, and it's going to be pretty tough to, I think it's going to be pretty tough for us not to have 33%. I guess what we could do is take out some of these like Jack X hands, and see how we fare then, and that would give us a little bit even better of a picture. Yeah, okay, so actually, I mean, we start taking out more of these like Jack X hands, and and some of the thinner hands that he might not value on the turn so highly, such as we shouldn't just say that he's going to always shove. Actually, we should say that he's always going to shove Queen 10 because of the 9, but something else a little bit a little weaker like Queen Jack. He may not shove with that. King Jack is shoving. Ace Jack, he might decide to check behind or something, since his hand isn't super strong. And you can actually see our equity does start to go down. It's one of those spots where it's pretty close, and so I would probably have to just stack off and see what he shows up with the first time. And if it's a flush, then it's a flush, and you get more information about his range by seeing which flush it was. So then we see that if it's like a Queen X, suited type hand, well, then when the flush comes on the turn, it's just so much more likely that he has it. However, if he shows up with like Ace Jack of hearts here, we shouldn't really be too surprised. So then, we would have to post the hand to get good feedback on it and see what other people think. Anyway, that was not the most rigorous analysis right there, and I apologize for that. But the idea was to show you how to play around a bit with PokerStove to see some of this equity stuff. And again, as always, if you have questions, let me know. So anyway, the original situation that I set out to show before getting sidetracked with the heads-up example was this one, where once we get this turn card, even though we pick up some equity, on the whole, we are losing equity against both people's ranges, and therefore, at this point, we should just check fold. Although, interestingly enough, if one of them shoves and the other guy calls, based on the... that's not right. I was going to say based on the ranges that we had before, we can call, but their shoving range is nowhere close to the same as their calling range. It just happens to be really similar since the turn card improves all the draws. Which is, I think, what was, throwing off my explanation of the heads-up situation before, so I apologize. Alrighty, so, moving along. We flat King Jack here on table 1 on the button, and running sevens or whatever decides to check. So, actually, let's go back to the action here. He in-raised under the gun, and I elected to call. I could have 3-bet this, and I actually was kind of torn between 3-betting and calling. I was feeling in sort of a, I guess, feeling in sort of a passive mood today, so I elected to call, and I think that that's okay. I mean, this might sound kind of trite, but your style of play is a function of sort of who you are as a person. Not just what you've learned, but also your personality. A guy that likes risk taking is going to play laggier than a guy who plays, or than a guy who would never go skydiving in his life and never ridden a roller coaster. You know what I mean? It's just it's stereotypical, I guess, but it tends to be true. And so if you're not feeling super crazy aggro, play a more passive style and see if you can get people to make mistakes that way too. Because there are definitely there's definitely more than one way to beat the games. So just try to, as always, just try to be self-aware and make sure that you're exploiting people. And so when I call with King Jack here, I got to realize that my plan is not just to hit a King or a Jack, although that's probably not too bad since it's only a min raise. But my plan here, since I didn't 3-bet, is going to be to still try to win this pot in some other way besides making the best hand, which is the same thing I'm trying to do if I 3-bet. Granted, if I 3-bet, I'm also trying to get a bit of value or induce mistakes post flop, right? But still, you get the idea. So in the king-jack hand, he's going to check to me, which I pretty much think is a sign that he's just giving up, you know. Now, this mistake right here is because I wasn't paying super close attention. I decided to bet 220. I think part of that also was that I'm used to playing some 25 NL too from the other videos, and seeing this pot size made me think I was sort of playing 25 NL, and at 25 NL I like to make sort of weirdish bets that don't involve the BB, because it's, you know, it's easier to type 220 than it is 225, and since it's 25 NL, you know, you're going to be more likely to use a 25-cent increment in terms of bet sizing. Interestingly enough, at like 1-2, people tend to not use $2 as the thing. They tend to do it in, you know, $1 increments even, you know, because it's a whole number, so it makes a little more sense than it does with a decimal, I guess. But anyway, when he checks here, I think he's giving up. Granted, you know, betting here probably doesn't fold out a ton of better hands, but if I can fold out ace high, and just in general, given the fact that I think he's checking and probably giving up, you know, I think I would rather bet here than give him a free card. Because I do have super great equity when called, and if I bet here, I can check back on the turn if I want, or I can barrel. Like if say a queen comes on the turn or an ace, you know, I'm probably going to be barreling that. Although an ace is, you know, maybe questionable because he could check call the flop with an ace. But I doubt it, actually. I think that if he has ace-x without a club, he would check fold if he was going to check. And if he had ace-x with a club, he would probably just bet the flop, you know. So if he does happen to call double barrel on an ace turn, we'll make a note and see what he has, but I think it would still be profitable. Okay, yeah, so anyway, I believe he folds. Now on table 2, if you were paying attention, you'll see the results of this other hand. So the the one guy does show up with queen jack, and Flavio here shows up with pocket 5. So this is important because we need to be making a read, or excuse me, make a note on this guy so that we can get a good read on him. He slow played a bottom set with a short stack on like the most draw heavy board ever, you know. So now that he's got a full stack, it's actually going to be a little bit more important since he's in position against us. We have to realize that he is going to slow play in some of these spots. And so, you know, it probably won't affect how we play against him too much, other than to realize that when he takes like a call, you know, a call, shove line or something like that, you know, on multiple streets, you know, he's probably just slow playing us. And you know, one other thing that, it's actually something I mentioned briefly with White Lime in the video I made with him recently, is that, you know, against guys that are willing to slow play or undervalue hands in this fashion, we actually got to be a little bit more careful when we thin value bet on the river. You know, you can go in and do some equity calculations and see for yourself, but you know, a good exercise might be to, you know, give this guy, let's play this out so the river comes out blank, right? And just give this guy a range of mostly like king x and then also 5x, or not 5x, pocket 5s. You know, and you can kind of see how your equity changes. I'm not going to get into that because I've already spent too much time boring you guys with poker stuff, I think, today. But it's definitely something worth investigating. Again, you know, I'd like to thank you guys for watching. I'm having a lot of fun making this series, and I hope you are having a lot of fun watching it. So, for everyone here at deucescrack.com, this has been TubaSteve, and I will see you next week. Hope to see you in the forums. Thanks, guys.